Hello and welcome to the Just in Time Cafe webinar. I'm Tracy O'Rourke, co-founder of the Just in Time Cafe, and I will be your moderator for today's very popular webinar titled How to Use Lean Thinking to Create an Anti-Racist Organization. And I'm happy to welcome Chris Chapman. How are you today, Chris? Chris, are you there?
Hi, Tracy.
There you are. All right, Chris, boy, I thought you left me, like you changed your mind or something. All right, let me tell you a little bit about Chris. Chris Chapman is a senior lean transformation coach at Chapman Lean Enterprise with extensive experience across a broad range of industries, including manufacturing, healthcare, and higher education. Chris has over 20 years of management, quality engineering, lean process improvement experience, and a Lean Six Sigma black belt. And he has written articles for leading trade publications and websites such as Quality Progress, Institute of Industrial Engineers, Occupational Hazards, and the Lean Post hosted by the Lean Enterprise Institute. So in just a few minutes, he's going to tell us all about this very intriguing topic. And just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. You can ask questions anytime by entering them in the chat area. There's also a question area, but we'll be using the chat area throughout the webinar. Don't forget to, if you want everyone to see your question, don't forget to hit all attendees when you put your question in the window. We welcome your participation. So we'll be asking you some questions and you'll be participating in some polls. And these webinars are available for viewing for free. We'll be posting them on the Just in Time Cafe website next week. So it looks like you guys are already doing what we ask our attendees to always do, and that is share where you are from. You have been registered from all over the world. And by the way, this webinar sold out. It hit our limit because Chris Chapman and this topic is so popular. So we are very excited about that. So if you tell us where you're from, we love to hear how late you are up. Let me take a look. We've got a lot of people. So Carol from the Port of Seattle. Sam, how are you from Vancouver, Washington? Carol also, she put in twice. Mark Graben, thank you for joining from LA. Rebecca from VT, Vermont. Heather also from Vermont. We have Rebecca from Virginia, Stacy from Houston, Hien from Tacoma. Hey, Hien. Dean, how are you from LA County? And Larry from the Port of Seattle. We also have Kathleen from New York. And we've got Deandra from Indianapolis. How are you? Kelly from Tokyo. Liz from Pennsylvania. Wow, we've got lots of people. And we are going to have hundreds of attendees today for this very important topic. So I am going to, without further ado, hand it over to Chris.
All right. Thank you, Tracy.
You are welcome.
Yeah, and welcome everyone. This is exciting for me as well. It's good to see that there's so much interest in the subject matter that I'll be talking about today. And thanks again to Tracy and Elizabeth. I think when they invited me to do this webinar, it was exciting for me because the two of them really inspire me. The work that they do and really their approach to Lean Six Sigma and continuous improvement. And so I was just telling a colleague a few weeks ago that the two of them seem to be having the most fun doing lean that I've seen in a long time. And so I think their fun and loving, if you will, approach to Lean Six Sigma and continuous improvement, I think it creates a very inclusive culture. And certainly their involvement with the Women in Lean, again, brings more people into and invites and makes more people feel like they belong in this continuous improvement space. So I just want to thank Tracy and Elizabeth for all the work that they do in that regard. All right, so again, we've got about an hour together. So typically when I do these kinds of workshops, it's tough to there's lots to talk about, and certainly I want to highlight some of the things that I was writing about over a year ago, and then give you an update as to what I'm working on now. And so let's dive right in. Okay. So here's the agenda. We're going to talk about systemic racism. We'll also talk about systemic thinking and lean thinking as a type of systemic thinking. We'll also talk about some of the lean principles, but we'll look at those through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. Then we'll wrap up with some of the benefits and ask and answer any questions that you might have as well. Okay. So as I mentioned, when Tracy and Elizabeth, reached out to me to ask me to take part in this, it was right about the time that I was starting to see a lot of reports in the media where they were looking back. It was May 25th, 2020, when we all witnessed the murder of George Floyd. And so recently I was seeing a lot of news reports looking back and reflecting on, okay, what's changed since then? And what sorts of things have changed? What's still left unchanged? And what work do we still need to do to improve matters? And so I can recall, if I reflect back shortly after viewing the murder of George Floyd on video, I'm sure like many of you, I was grappling with what could I do to try and make an impact and to help address racism in America. And so shortly after I witnessed that, I started writing articles. In fact, as I was still grappling with the idea of what to do, I came across a newsletter from the Lean Enterprise Institute, where I believe it was Jim Womack who was discussing how they would use their problem solving and lean thinking know-how to help try and root out systemic racism once and for all. And so when I read that, I thought, yep, that's exactly what I'd like to try and do. And so long story short, I started writing some articles for their post, their blog post, The Lean Post, and started having some conversations with them about what we might be able to do, and collaborative opportunities and that sort of thing. And so I wrote a number of articles for those guys, and as we were kind of talking through that, as lean thinkers do, right, in the continuous improvement community, we really arrived at we actually, in the true spirit of lean process improvement, we'll need to at some point begin to experiment with some of these concepts that I was writing about in the post. And so here's a list of those articles that I wrote for the Lean Post. And so I'm going to highlight some of the key themes and central points to some of these articles. I'd certainly encourage you to visit Lean Enterprise Institute's The Lean Post to read these, or perhaps reread these after the presentation. So I'm going to revisit some of those key points. I'm also going to highlight some of the work that I'm currently doing with my colleague, Dr. Sinclair Chapman, who's the diversity expert on our team. And so I'll share with you some of the work that we're doing and the path forward that we see regarding applying lean to help create anti-racist organizations. Okay, so racism, I don't think this is a news bulletin for for the audience here. But it's a systemic problem. And I think, at least for me, one of the encouraging things in the wake of the murder of George Floyd is that that's how I'm hearing people describe racism. So as many experts have talked about in terms of, hey, racism isn't about whether, or isn't only about whether you're a racist or not. It's really about what are you doing to help address the barriers within society that discriminates against folks that are underrepresented in our organizations. And so it's encouraging to hear people say, hey, this is a systemic problem. This isn't something that we're going to solve with a to-do list of items. This isn't something we're going to solve overnight. It really is systemic. And so while it's encouraging to hear people talk about it in terms of it being a systemic problem, I think where there is quite a huge opportunity for improvement here is to begin thinking about it systemically. Okay, and so with our first poll question, and we're going to revisit this later in the presentation, do you think racism is a problem at your organization? Yes, no, or not sure.
So while we're waiting for people to do the poll, Chris, what do you, I'm sure you've asked people this before, so what have people said? Yes, no, or not sure in the past?
Well, just in light of, the process improvement approach, our first step is to first kind of acknowledge that we have a problem. And so this is really just a bit of a reality check. Okay. Mm-hmm. And I know this can be an uncomfortable conversation to have. And that's why I'm so pleased to be on your webinar today, because part of the lesson learned here, lessons that we're learning, is to engage in this kind of conversation that has traditionally been uncomfortable.
Yes.
And so anytime we're trying to solve a problem, we have to somehow overcome that discomfort. And so this is just a reality check. Hey, what are you thinking? And then we're going to revisit this poll question afterwards as we talk a bit more about systemic racism and what that means.
So just to share, 48 or 58% said yes, 14 said no, 14%, and 27% said they're not sure.
Okay.
So we'll see what happens later.
Okay, good. All right. And so 76% of Americans, according to Ibram Kendi, says it's a big problem. Okay. And I would certainly agree with that. And you get a better sense of that, I would say. And I think that was essentially the understanding coming out of witnessing the murder of George Floyd. We recognize that there's a systemic problem here. And it's not that this is something new, right? We've had social justice groups really trying to sound the alarm for quite some time. And I think many of us, myself included, probably thought things were better than they actually were. And so I think George Floyd was a wake-up call to our country, to business leaders, across the country, and citizens in this country and around the world. And so you begin to get a sense that there's a much larger system at work when you begin to take a closer look at, what occurred in the murder of George Floyd. And so, Derek Chauvin, clearly he's been convicted. That's a step in the right direction. Certainly, you want to, as some people mention, you want to address certainly those so-called bad apples in the system. But there's more going on than that, I would argue. And you see it in his fellow police officers that were also on the scene. As I looked at it initially, I thought, my goodness, how do you not intervene when a citizen, your customer, if you will, to use lean language, is being harmed in this way, being murdered right before you? How is it that you don't intervene? And so you get a better sense of the system that's working behind the scenes, so to speak, when you look at Carol Horn, who was also a police officer, not in Minneapolis, but in Buffalo, New York, where she was a police officer at the time, chose to intervene to save the life of a citizen who was being brutally abused by a fellow police officer, and she was terminated. And so the system is producing those kinds of outcomes. She intervened, was terminated. Mr. Chauvin's colleagues didn't intervene. And I would argue because they had, being insiders in that system, they probably knew how that system would react if they did intervene. And so now you're seeing policies and laws being passed, right, to try and ensure that police officers, when they witness that sort of thing, that they do intervene. There's, laws being passed around barring choking. And so those are the right sorts of things to do, certainly steps in the right direction. But as lean thinkers, we would still look at that and say, okay, you've implemented these sorts of corrective measures, but there's more work to be done here regarding the system to prevent those kinds of harmful outcomes. Right. And so Edward Deming, that most of you know, is the father of quality circles and certainly the Deming continuous improvement cycle or problem solving cycle. He argued that 90% of our problems are due to bad systems. And I would certainly agree with that. Right. It's not so much bad people. Granted, they're, bad apples or bad actors within the system. Certainly you want to address that. But if all we're doing is, convicting or removing the bad apples, then we haven't done the hard work and the very much needed work to redesign those systems. And so Greenleaf, author of Servant Leader, he points this out as well, that, hey, there's people that are the programmers or writers, or we're the ones creating these systems. And so that's, I like to think that that's, from a purely observational standpoint, you would say, my goodness, why are you creating systems that create these sorts of undesirable outcomes? But on the flip side of that, it's, hey, if we created it, then we can improve it. If we designed it, we can redesign it. And so I think Greenleaf hits on a key point here around, as we think about, leading our organizations, we need to think about leadership a bit differently that it's about service and stewardship. Okay. And that's something that we as lean thinkers, that's how we tend to look at process improvement, right? That it's about serving customers. So I'll say more about that. And then we need to think of ourselves as stewards of that system. And so, and really begin to look at what kinds of outcomes are we generating. And so that's what I loved about what Kendi, author of How to Be an Antiracist, how he put it. These are written or unwritten laws, rules, procedures, processes, right, that are producing and normalizing racial inequity, okay, that result in two or more racial groups not standing on approximately equal footing. And so when I read that, and this is some of the work that I've been doing, right, in addition to writing, been researching and reading, even took some diversity training at Cornell University, online course. But when I read this, I thought, man, that's a definition, right? And in the continuous improvement community, we know about, to solve a problem, how important it is to define that problem correctly. And when I read this from Kendi, I thought, man, I can work with that. He's talking about systems producing, an outcome or a result. In this case, the racial inequity. And so, okay, as a systemic thinker, okay, I can work with that as a means of kind of looking at systems and the outcomes. Been doing this for over 20 years, looking at outcomes that improve productivity, quality, safety, those sorts of things. Well, the key point that I'm making to you today is that we can use that transformational framework, that we know as lean thinking, to help improve, outcomes related to diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. And Kendi goes on to say every system in every community, in every nation, is producing or sustaining either racial inequity or equity. Okay? You're doing one or the other, right? And so D'Angelo, author of White Fragility, another great book that, I read as, I'm trying to learn and thinking about how you might apply lean thinking to this. She put it this way: it's networks of norms and actions and culture and institutions that consistently advantage whites and disadvantage people of color. And again, I thought, man, as a lean thinker, I can use that as a definition to help me better define the problem here. And so here again, D'Angelo in her book, White Fragility, talks about, the outcomes of these systems. This is what it's producing and normalizing. You look at Congress, another system, right? 90% white. Governors, another system. What's it producing in terms of, racial outcomes? 96% white. Top military advisors. This has improved a bit since the election of President Biden, but again, teachers, 82% white. Full-time professors, 84% white. Those are outcomes of a system. And so, man, wouldn't it be great if we began to take a closer look, a more critical look at this system that is producing and normalizing these undesired outcomes? Okay, so racism is a systemic problem. I think we can all agree to that. And what I am proposing here today is that we use systemic thinking to solve that problem. Okay. And so this systemic thinking, like lean thinking, this isn't anything new, right? Many of us have been practicing this for a long time. There's tons of research about systemic thinking. Ackhoff and Singe, they've done tons of work about this. Singe, The Fifth Discipline, very good book. I'd certainly recommend it. More of the reading that I've been doing, over this last year. But looking at the value stream, and that's language that, the lean thinking community, many of you in the audience will recognize. These are systems, right? To make improvements is an example of this thinking systemically. And so we're trying to, it encourages improvements to be made to the system as a whole. And so I think to reach this higher level of serving our customers, we got to start looking at the whole system and, not just simply do the easy things or the things that, as we like to say in the lean thinking community, we're cherry picking these, they may be feel good sorts of things that we're doing, or the low hanging fruit, so to speak, and certainly, address those opportunities that require, they don't require as much effort and as many resources. Absolutely, you have to do that, but we can't stop there. We've got to look at the whole and transform that system if we want to prevent, the type of harm that we witnessed on May 25th from reoccurring. And so lean thinking, I'm sure many of you, know some of the history and background of that as well, but this is a term coined by Womack and Jones to capture the essence of their in-depth study of the Toyota production system, okay, or TPS, or what some refer to as the thinking people system, okay. It's a transformational framework, and I italicize that for a reason. It's a framework that we can use. And I'm going to highlight an example of using that framework to help create an anti-racist system. But it aims to provide a new way to think about how to organize human activities to deliver more benefits to society and value to individuals while eliminating waste. Many of you may think about it in terms of doing more with less, human effort, equipment, time, space, fewer resources, that sort of thing, while getting closer to providing the customer with exactly what they want. And in a recent interview, someone asked me to find lean in 5 words or less. The interviewer, Sam, I think you're online, Sam Morgan. If any of you follow CI in 5, I did interview with him on that, and he challenged me to define it in 5 words or less. And after thinking about it for a while, I thought, okay, it's aiming for perfection. You're striving to achieve excellence. It's continuous improvement. It's Kaizen. It's respect for people. It's all those things. But when I boiled it down to what I think is the essence of lean, it's about perfecting the process of serving customers. Okay. And I always add an extra word, but just to keep it at 5 words or less, it's perfecting process of serving customers. And when I tend to talk about it, I add the "the." It's perfecting the process of serving customers. But it really is focused on serving customers and perfecting that process. And so in the lean community, we know that to perfect a process is to eliminate the waste out of the process, the things that aren't value added from our customer standpoint. Okay. And so Tom Peters, author of Excellence Now and In Search of Excellence, Excellence Now is his most recent book. When I came across this and Excellence Now, I thought, And Tom, he's been an advocate. He's been pushing the importance of, growing people. It's not about growing revenues and profit. It's about growing people. And so he builds on that point here around the squint test, another kind of reality check of sorts for leaders. He says here, look at the picture of the executive team, your marketing team, product development team, the teams within your organization, right? The purchasing team. Do every one of these pictures look approximately like the market being served? So in other words, do your internal, to use lean language again, your internal customers, your employees that make up your company, do they reflect the market being served? i.e. your customer, right? Your customer ought to be able to look at your organization and the teams within your organization and see themselves, see the full diversity of who they are in your organization. And Mr. Peters here is saying, hey, if they don't, hey, there's some opportunity there, and we need to get busy addressing that. And that it's not a strategic priority. This is the strategic priority, right? Because this is about serving customers. And I would argue if it's about serving that customer, then we all know what happens, right? Your customer seeks out another provider to serve them, right? And so that's what this is about. And so, as my colleague, Dr. Sinclair Chapman would say, hey, this isn't about missionary work. This isn't charity to address systemic racism. Oh, we're going to help the, underrepresented because, it's the right thing to do. It is, but it's not charity work. This is about serving your customer. And so, if it's important to the customer, if they see it as value, if the customer is saying, hey, to root out systemic racism is important to us. When we look at your organization, it needs to reflect back to us the diversity that we are. Then that's not charity work. That's your purpose. Your purpose is to serve that customer. And so that has to be the strategic priority. And these aren't new themes for us in the lean thinking community. There's a long history of us focusing on our processes and systems to better serve the customer. Rother and Shook, authors of Learning to See, you guys know the book, it's the one most of us probably started out, studying when we learned to value stream map. They said whenever there's a product for a customer, there's a value stream. There's a system, in other words, that we go through to serve that customer, right? And so, they mentioned if there's a product for a customer, I would further simplify that and say if there's a customer, that customer is purchasing a product or service from you, from your organization. And so if there's a customer, there's a value stream, or there's a system there, the challenge is in seeing it. And so I would say, these systems are made up of internal customers. Those are the employees within your organization. And they're all working together, serving one another to ultimately serve the external customer. And so that's the work we're doing. And so, when we think about that value stream or system, we also know in the lean thinking community, there's 5 key lean principles. And so there's 5 of them. You're probably well aware of these. Value versus waste, value stream, flow pool, and perfection. We're not going to talk about all 5, but I do want to spend some time talking about the first 2, which are foundational to all the continuous improvement work that you'll do. You'll also know, and this isn't anything new. Michael George, who wrote all the books about Lean Six Sigma, he was writing about this stuff, years ago, that typical US companies spend less than 10% of their time on value-added activities. And for those of you that have done value stream mapping, measured value-added time and non-value-added time, you know this to be true, right? It's not unusual to find it less than 10%. Okay, and just to clearly define what we mean by this value-added activity, typically we think about it in terms of activities that change the shape of materials into finished products, right? Or actions that advance the customer towards a desired outcome, right? And basically something the customer's willing to pay for. That's a value-added activity. And so that's what we're trying to optimize, right? Folks working on value-added activity that's important to the customer. Okay. And so, and then there's waste. So within these systems, you've got value-added activity, a bunch of waste or non-value-added activity. And the waste we define as activities that consume resources and time, or they're barriers that don't add any value. They're not supportive. They don't advance your customer towards their desired outcome or long-term goal. We tend to think about this stuff and we measure all kinds of this sort of waste, right? There's transportation, the motion, the overproduction, defects, right? We're all familiar with that. We measure it all the time. Why do we do that? Because it gets in the way of us serving our customer, right? Well, I would say this kind of waste, which I'm referring to as DEI waste, right? It's having a similar kind of non-value added impact on our customer. Unequal access. If you're a customer of color, internal customer, an employee, how is that helping you? Is that supportive? Absolutely not. Discriminatory practices, right? That's not helping you advance you. That's not helping you develop or grow. Racist ideas and policies, prejudices, stereotypes. And just like much of the waste that we would typically look at, this is stuff that, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here a little bit, but you go into organizations and you point out this excessive inventory, much of which you see a layer of dust on it and you realize, man, you haven't used that in a while. Right? And when you step back and you begin to observe people working and you see that, wow, there's a lot of unnecessary motion involved. And so, overproduction or overprocessing, these are things that oftentimes are right before your eyes, right? They're not hidden, but sometimes it helps when you have an outside consultant or someone come in and point it out. Hey, what about this excessive inventory? Hey, what about this excessive distance that's being traveled? And so I would argue this diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI waste, we need to start taking a look at this because these are the sorts of things that are barriers. They aren't supporting, our employees of color that we're recruiting and bringing into these systems. And so on the one hand, okay, we just improved our diversity, but you've brought them into a system that isn't going to help them grow and develop. And so if we're trying to best serve our customers and we're committed to doing this kind of transformational work of our systems, then we can no longer ignore this sort of stuff or continue to walk around with blinders on as if it's not having an impact on how we serve our customers. Okay. And so again, I think Kendi provides some guidance in that regard. And so I adapted this from his book, How to Be an Antiracist. He talks about policies, systems, practices that produce and normalize racial equity, right? And so from a process or systems perspective, that's value added. Let's do more of that. And for the systems and policies that produce and normalize racial inequity, hey, that just hit our radar right along with the transportation, the overproduction. And so it's not one or the other. I don't want you to think I'm saying, oh, this is the other work you do when you have time. No, I'm saying as you're transforming value streams, this is waste that we've got to address too. Why? Because it's preventing us from serving our customer. And if we don't serve our customer, we know how that plays out in the marketplace. You know, the organizations that best serve the customers at the highest level, you know, this is what excellence looks like. You know, this is the higher level of performance that we're trying to strive to achieve. And so when you start to go down that path of, okay, what are some more of these barriers that are preventing people of color and folks that are underrepresented in your organization from growing and developing and, you know, adding value, you know, to their fullest potential, right? And that's the name of the game. We're doing this transformational work to help our employees, who are our internal customers, provide the highest level of value. And they can't do that if they're in environments where they aren't able to bring their whole selves to work, right? So the unconscious bias, the assumptions that we have about people that don't look like us, that don't share our, that don't share our experiences, we have to address that. Why? Because it's important to our customer, right? You know, when you're sitting in meetings and you're seeing colleagues being talked over, right, or interrupted, that becomes a form of waste, you know, a barrier to us, you know, serving, right? Disrespectful treatment of team members, preferential treatment of some members over others, all forms of waste, right? And so this is what I believe is the work that we must do. You know, we're doing the transformational work. Now this is the next level to that. Quite frankly, our external customer is telling us very loudly and clearly that we need to address and root out systemic racism. And it's my belief that the companies that embrace that challenge and do it at a high level, they're going to grow and they're going to be the leaders in the marketplace. And so denouncing racism, right thing to do. Hiring, you know, diversity officers, certainly the right thing to do. All directionally correct, but we've got to do the work of transforming these systems. And we've got a transformational framework, i.e. lean thinking, lean management system, Toyota production system, whatever you call it. That's a framework that we has a successful track record of transforming organizations. And so we can use that. There are more lists of, you know, waste. I'm not going to go through all of those stereotypes, in-group and out-group distinctions. If you walk into an organization and everyone in a leadership position is white or white males, then that sends a very strong message to your employees, your internal customer, that if you're a person of color, I'm in an out group, that's the in group. And so we got to address that, you know, to create the kind of environment where everyone can bring their whole self and provide their highest level of value to the system, right? So, okay. Stop preaching on that point. So briefly, what kinds of DEI waste, after reviewing the list there, have you seen in your organization? Just take a few seconds there and share your comments in the chat, if you would, please.
Okay, so what we're seeing is unequal access for patients. Thank you for that. Lack of upward mobility. Lack of diversity in senior leadership.
Okay. Good.
Explicit microaggressions to staff of color.
Okay.
Senior leadership mostly being white, underutilization of talent, lack of racial minorities in senior level positions, lack of development, lack of interest in staff as people, just workers. Our staff doesn't represent the diversity of our farmers and ranchers. Fear. Women representation in executive management. Deflection of issues. POC being told they talk too much about DEI.
Wow.
A surge of comments on this question.
Okay.
Let's see, lack of diversity, underrepresentation. I've seen inventory waste, right? Waste. People have, I'm sorry, as people type in the moves on me. People have conversations and learn about racism, but don't use it to impact change. They just store it away.
Right.
BIPOC people leaving the organization after they get hired because they feel like white leadership doesn't care. Preferential treatment of some members over others. POC, by the way, is people of color, in case you needed that. Gaslighting is being told that what you're experiencing isn't happening. Lack of action or repercussions against racist acts, being talked over during meetings. We don't have a problem. Checklist of EDI. Staff turnover, because lower status staff isn't supported, usually people of color. Kim says leadership saying they care about this, but do not demonstrate this through they ask for engagement from others in it. Lots of comments here, Chris. Thank you for asking.
Yeah, sure.
What do we do?
Yeah. So, one, recognize the waste and begin to measure and understand its impact. And the good news is, and I'm going to draw some parallels here, and that we measure waste. We know how to measure it. The value stream is the next principle. And we think about that in terms of all the actions, both value added, non-value added, required to deliver a desired outcome to or to fulfill a need or demand of the customer. Key processes is that employee is going to encounter from the time they're hired until the time they separate from the organization. That's our value stream. And so, it typically looks like this. We're going to, map out all of the key steps within the value stream, so this is a healthcare example, and I just wanted to present this to give you a sense of, this is how we go about mapping out processes. So if you were the customer entering into this healthcare facility or system, first step is going to be triage, there's registration, there's exams, it flows from left to right. We're going to measure the value added time that you see reflected in the data box here, right? Reflected as a cycle time. 4 minutes, cycle times 3 minutes for registration, and so on and so forth. That's what we refer as the value added time. And when we add up all of those cycle times, our value added time is 46 minutes. Well, when we start measuring the non-value added time or activity, right, which is reflected in that lead time, we get 165 minutes, right? And so, that's going to include both your non-value add and value add. But when we subtract out that 46 minutes, that's 119 minutes of, non-value added time that, we can work on, right? And so, again, we have tools and approaches to doing this sort of thing. And what I'm challenging you here today is to use a similar kind of approach. You're still, for organizations practicing lean, you're developing value stream maps, right? You're identifying, the traditional forms of waste. We can also take a deeper look at that, value stream from recruitment to retirement. That's a value stream. And we can organize our employees into Kaizen teams. We're already doing that in companies practicing lean. And so what I'm encouraging you to do, you're already assembling cross-functional teams, add that diversity officer or that diversity change agent to the team to help you reflect and analyze that process, right? And provide any training that might be needed. But more importantly, to begin mapping out these processes, identifying what you see reflected in here with the Kaizen burst of the barriers that exist, and start using some of these problem-solving tools to help address that. Okay. And so my colleague and I, we've been doing some work with the university. And when we assembled a team of folks to look at their value stream at the organization, these were some of the barriers they started to identify, right? And we've yet to pull the student into that conversation, but that's where we're headed, as to really solicit the input of the student as a customer and viewing them as a customer and really trying to get a better understanding of what can we do to improve this system. Now, one way of looking at it that will limit continuous improvement is to say, hey, this is an excellent university or institution and only the best will survive or get through, right? Not much improvement going on there. But if we stop and begin to reflect on, and this is where I think focusing on the underrepresented and the minority students or customers, if you improve that system for them, you're going to improve it for everybody. That's going to be a much better system for everyone. But we're focusing on, hey, who are the folks entering this system? One, that are underrepresented, and two, once they enter the system, how can we be good stewards of that system to ensure that they have racial equity going through the system? So, I know we're coming close to the end here, but for this group at a university, they started looking at it, and they saw, SAT scores as a main deciding factor for entry into the system. Oh, that's a barrier for some. What might we do differently, right? And so it's being open to reflect continually. And we know this to be the work that is never ending, reflecting on that system and continually improving it to bring about change that's in the best interest of our customers. And so, for this university, they're going to start looking at their recruitment events. There's low attendance. Now, one could say, well, they just won't come and put it all on the customer. The continuous improvement perspective is to say, hey, what changes can we make to better serve? Some of the students have what they refer to as an imposter syndrome. Hey, what can we do to help support the student? There's a failure rate or withdrawal rate for certain students. What can we do to better serve them? And so it keeps coming back to, the institution. And so, and that's what I think we're going to have to do to establish anti-racist organizations. And so again, traditionally, we're measuring stuff like cycle times, inventory quantities, setup reduction, lead times, that sort of stuff. For this diversity, equity, and inclusion measures, as we're walking through that value stream, we're going to start looking at percentages of people by race and ethnicity working in a process. So you're already measuring staff. Let's start to look at, okay, how's that break down across race and ethnicity? What's the makeup of our customer base, right? Retention rates, how's that break down? When we look through the race and ethnicity, promotion rates, average time to progress to the next process. And so we're already measuring that time from process 1 to 2. But when you break it down across race, you may find that, hey, that time gets even longer there's other kinds of errors associated with, minority groups flowing through that process. And so we want to begin to look at that so that we can problem solve. High visibility projects, who's getting those projects? Are underrepresented folks, having access, being developed? Do they have the same rate of access and developmental opportunities as their white colleagues? We can begin to measure that across the value stream. And so here's just a quick example that we did at the university. We're still populating information, but I wanted to share this just to give you a sense of how we're applying this. So we're writing about it a year ago, and now we're starting to apply it. I had some clients read the articles that we pulled together. Valeria Sinclair Chatton and myself pulled together over a year ago, and now we're applying it. And this is what it could look like, student as the customer flowing through this process. So we looked at a cohort and basically mapped out their progression through this process. And so you can see that, we looked at a high level, white, Black, and Hispanic students. This is the incoming class. We're experiencing fallout every year as we go through this process. And if you were a student or parents of a student, I'm sure many of you can relate to it. If you went into this process thinking, okay, my son or daughter just enrolled in this college for the next 4 years, and they're coming out at the end of 4 years, graduating, we got a news bulletin for you. Many of the folks that entered this system, these higher education institutions, they don't graduate in 4. And so we see that here on the value stream map. For white students, about 60% of them are going to graduate in 4 years. For Black students, about 43%, a little over 43%, Hispanic, about 46%. And so if we can begin to organize teams, much the way we do with implementing lean, man, we can start to transform this system in such a way that we increase those graduation rates for everyone. But by focusing on, what Martin Luther King would say is the least of these, or the folks that are being underrepresented in this process, we're going to improve it for everyone. And so, that's the work we're doing. So we're starting to run the experiments. And, once we identify the Kaizen burst, there's an action plan. So whether you're using value stream work plans or A3 action plans, this is the continuous improvement work where we're engaging leadership, the employees, organizing Kaizens and continuous improvement to keep that transformation going. And so that's the aim, and the final principle, DEI perfection, it's zero waste, zero racism. We're aiming for, complete elimination of the waste, including the diversity, equity, and inclusion waste that I mentioned today. So this is the lean work that very important work that we have to do. And so I listed some of the benefits here. I want to be mindful of time, but I'll just touch on this first one, and it operationalizes the DEI efforts. Okay, so it's not an improvement here or there, but we make it the way that the organization operates. That this continuous improvement is the way that we're conducting business and going about serving our customers. And this lean thinking framework can help us do that. All right, so we've close to the end here. After talking about systemic racism and lean thinking, I'll ask the question again: do you think racism is a problem at your organization? Yes, no, or not sure.
Okay, while we're waiting for everybody to respond, I think we're going to go over time just a little bit. If you could stay for some questions, that's wonderful, Chris. I know that most people do have to drop off at 12, but we'll hang around just a little bit and see if we can finish up some of these slides, and then also maybe some questions.
Okay. And I'll just leave this this one quote from Tom Peters. If you've seen him in interviews with Mark Graven or something, you got to love his energy. And I can just imagine him saying this. But this is a quote from his book, Excellence Now. And I think it really gets at the point. We got to get after it, as they say.
Yes.
There's a way to do that.
Yes. Well, I will say that the poll results are in, and more people are now saying, yes, there is a racism problem at their organization. 85% are now saying yes. 8% are now saying no, and 6% are saying not sure. So you have had an impact already on the attendees for this webinar.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, so I can absolutely stick around and answer any questions. Let me put my contact information. Oh, I'm zooming through stuff, but my contact information's at the end. They'll save that as well. So
wonderful. Thank you so much. And so his contact information is there. I know some of you have to drop off the deck. We will have this as a recording. Chris, some people are asking for the slides. I'm going to leave that to you. I'm not going to put pressure on it. We did put your information in the chat. So if they want to get a hold of you, they can ask. And somebody wants you to come and present at another conference. So she'll be reaching out as well.
Okay, sure.
And I'll just say really quickly, we have another webinar coming up on June 24th. And this is really more about changing culture is hard, but building new behaviors is even easier. It's harder, but using task cards can sometimes make that easier. And it could be task cards that involve DEI as well. So it's about changing leader behaviors on June 24th. Join us at 11 a.m. I'll be presenting. Elizabeth will be moderating. And then we also have our latest podcast out there, Winning Customers by Keeping Promises, featuring Jeff Twaister. He's the author of The Guaranteed Customer Experience. If you're struggling with creating great experiences or having product guarantees, come and hear the podcast. He's a thought leader and award-winning educator. Okay, now let's see if we can get to some questions. Let's see. So I've got a couple of them. One of them I'll just share. Larry is saying, I've been struggling with wrangling my thoughts about and articulating using lean is an anti-racism approach. He says it's really crystallizes thinking, and a great presentation from Kate. So not a question there, but a comment.
Okay.
And then there was a question. Do you have any suggestions for making the case to senior leadership to use DEI-focused lean thinking to improve policies and processes? Any suggestions there to build the case? I mean, they could probably take your presentation, which is probably why people want it.
Yeah, and by all means, I'm willing to share that with folks. And just to let you know, as I move forward and apply more of this, I hope to share lessons learned along the journey in formats like this, and we'll continue to write articles. And so I know I haven't written in a bit, but been doing actually, applying the work. But I intend, my partner and I intend to continue writing and sharing. So I would say if you're familiar with value stream mapping, perhaps start to experiment with some of what I presented here today. And so many of you have acknowledged that the waste exists. And so just as you would do with the traditional types of waste, I would say begin trying to measure it in some way. And so, and once you start to measure it, then, again, this is part of the work that we have to do. Begin trying to have these conversations with leaders that you trust. That you feel like will be open to having the discussion. And oftentimes what we do in lean, we as I like to say, you get in where you can fit in. And so if there's some leaders that you feel like are open to this kind of thing, this kind of experimentation, and you've had some conversations with that feel like, hey, I want to transform this culture so that it helps people feel like they belong and are able to bring their whole selves to work. That's probably an area where you can begin to organize some teams and do some of the things that I suggested in this presentation.
And I'll do one last question since we're over time anyways, but it's my friend Hien. So I'm going to go ahead and ask it to you. How do you answer the question to leadership who say lean and DEI are two separate issues? Don't combine them.
Yeah, and again, it's a form of waste. And I think if you're really listening to the voice of your customer, I think many of your customers out there, both internal and external, are saying this is important. And so, you don't have to take my word for it. I'd say run that experiment. And as internal customers are jumping ship because they don't feel like they belong, as external customers are looking at your organization and thinking, they don't reflect the diversity of who we are, and they seek out other providers, I think you gotta deal with that. And so this is again, as my colleague says, this isn't missionary work. You can go ahead and continue to think, oh, this is separate from serving customers. And I would say run that experiment and let me know how it works out for you. Because the leaders in the marketplace, they're going to be the ones that are responsive, and they always have been, are the ones that are most responsive to their customer. Nothing's changed here. And so continue thinking that way, run that experiment. We're going to be running experiments on this end. I'm going to be writing about it, and I'll be sharing with you what we find. And I'd encourage you to do the same if that works for you.
Chris, I can't thank you enough for coming to the cafe, for a wonderful cup of coffee and some really enlightening thoughts around lean and using lean to build an anti-racist organization. And I have a feeling that we're going to have to do more of these coming up somehow, collaborating with a few other people to bring some of these really important educational webinars about this topic. So thank you so much, Chris. And thank you everybody for joining.
Yeah, thanks everyone.